Hey everyone, welcome back to Reissued. If you're new here, my name is Andrew. Today I am going to show you how I reupholstered a thrifted bed and transformed it from basic and busted to chic and expensive looking, hopefully. So I have seen so many beds like this at the thrift store and on Facebook Marketplace, and often they have stains or pulls or tears in the fabric, and that can be really hard to overlook. So reupholstering this is going to unlock loads of potential for rescuing thrifted beds, and it doesn't hurt that we're going to save a lot of money in the process. I can't wait to get started today. Let's jump on in. Okay, so before we get started today, two things. First, if you love thrifting and thrift flips and home makeover content and you're not already subscribed to my channel, go ahead and hit the subscribe button. I'm gonna be using the bed that we're thrift flipping today as a part of a future bedroom makeover, so stay tuned for that. And secondly, not that anyone really cares because I know we're all about what I'm making here and not about what I look like, but I have been having a major eczema breakout on my face over the last couple of months. I've been feeling really self-conscious about it. I've been trying to cover it up with makeup for videos, and it's just not getting better. It's not really a big deal. I've been dealing with eczema my whole life, but it is different to turn on the camera and have your face be very present and to not feel great about how you look. But yeah, I've been feeling that a lot lately, and I just want to put that out there so I can set it aside and not worry about it anymore and just focus on healing. So there you go. All right, project time. First things first, I'm shooting this entire project at my parents' house because my house is super pulled apart for the living room renovation, and because these bed pieces don't fit in my car, so it just felt easier to work on everything there at my parents' house. I mentioned back in the Florida house tour video that we need a new bed for Katie's bedroom since the screen that used to be a headboard in there is now moving out. A lot of our inspiration images for this room had velvet upholstered beds, and so I started shopping around and pulling product images, and wow, these are expensive. Most of the pieces that I liked ended up being between $1,000 and $4,000 because I am broke with expensive taste. But when I saw this bed pop up at the REISSUED for $100, I had a feeling that we could work some reissued magic on this and make it work. What I like about this bed is the kind of wingback shape on the headboard and that it's fully upholstered on the sides and footboard, not just on the headboard. What I don't love about this bed is the shabby cream upholstery and the basic legs that scream, "I came from Rooms to Go." No offense to Rooms to Go, but we can do better. Now, even though we have some subtle curves on the headboard and footboard and some stitched areas, this piece is mostly made up of upholstered rectangles, which are pretty simple to do. So while the idea of reupholstering a whole bed felt pretty intimidating to me, this bed feels manageable because the shapes are pretty basic and there seems to be minimal sewing and tailoring necessary. So if you're looking for a thrifted bed to reupholster, I recommend looking for clean lines, square shapes, minimal curves, and not too many seams. Unless you're amazing at upholstery, in which case, go crazy. I decided to reupholster this bed in this blushy velvet that I got at Fabric Joint in Decatur for $15 a yard. Matt and I have been going to the store lately for various fabrics that we need for different projects, and I love their selection and their price points. I got 5 yards of this, which brought my total to $75. So I think we can keep this whole project under $200 before tax. That still feels like kind of a lot, but not bad at all for a king bed. So the first thing we need to do here is lay out the pieces that we need on paper to make the best use of the fabric. It's particularly important with this fabric since the velvet has a nap that combs one way, and I want all of the pieces on the bed to be the same way so that the color appears consistent. Plus, I didn't really get any extra fabric, so we need to make every cut count. So with the cutting plan in mind, I start with the largest piece for the headboard. This fabric is not wide enough to allow me to do the full headboard, footboard, or rails in one piece since I wanted the nap to comb downward on all the pieces. So I'll need to do additional seams on every piece to achieve that look. You can definitely avoid this by choosing a fabric that's not so specific with the grain and running it sideways instead of up and down. That would be way easier, but you know I love to make everything complicated. I cut out my pieces one by one and placed them on the bed as I went, which I'm glad I did because this is the point that I realized that the fabric was not as wide as I thought it was. It's not big enough. When I did all my measurements, I was assuming the fabric was 60 inches because that's pretty standard, but this was actually closer to 54 inches. So luckily I caught this error in time to reconfigure the layout a little bit before I cut the rest of my pieces. For all of the cutting, my mom's helping me to hold and lay out the fabric since this is a lot of fabric to handle. I also cut some strips out of a black fabric that I've had on hand forever. This was actually in my car on the way to get donated, and then I thought, oh, I might need that for pattern making. And then I ended up needing it for the actual piece itself, so I'm glad I had this on hand. So let's get to sewing. First, I'm going to sew all of my panels right sides together for each section. So here I'm starting on the footboard, making sure that the grains line up the same way, pinning along the edge, and then stitching this on my sewing machine. I can then repeat this process for the other end of the footboard, as well as the side rail pieces and the headboard. Again, these are added seams that were not on the original headboard, but I needed them to make my fabric run the right way. Now that we have all of our panels assembled, I thought it would look better to top stitch this. So I pulled the seam allowance to one side and pinned it in place to top stitch. This will help the seam allowance to sit flat and give a really professional look. When doing the opposite side rail, I'm careful to make sure that my seam allowance gets pushed the other way so that these pieces are nice and symmetrical. As usual, this project is more in-depth than I anticipated, so let's take a quick break at my house and get it pick-me-up with Mud Water, which is the sponsor of today's video. Ever feel a little extra flutter in your chest or shakiness in your arms or anxiety in your mind when you take on a big project? Maybe you're just doing something that you've never done before and you're terrified to mess it up. I know that's me. Or maybe you just had too much coffee. That used to be me. I love the ritual of coffee and taking a little beverage break here and there, but I've been super conscious lately about how that can make me feel extra jittery and uneasy and add to my anxiety. So for my afternoon beverage breaks, I've been loving Mud Water. Not only does Mud Water taste like a spicy combination of chai and cacao, but it also contains powerful and organic ingredients including lion's mane, cordyceps, and reishi that promote focus, energy, and immunity. But with a fraction of the caffeine of coffee, so no jitters and no crash. And it's super easy to prepare. Just mix it with hot water and add a little honey or milk or sugar, or I don't know, get fancy with one of the recipes in their recipe book. Right now, click the link in the description or scan the QR code on screen to get started with the Mud Water Starter Pack, and be sure to use my code REISSUED for 15% off your starter pack plus a free frother. For your next big project, get the pick-me-up without the jitters with Mud Water. Okay, we're back. So let's go ahead and add our black strips of fabric to the bottom of the headboard piece and the top of the footboard piece. This will give us a clean attachment point so that we don't see any staples in these areas. Speaking of staples, my dad and I started removing some staples on the original upholstery. Now, I mentioned in a previous video that I took an upholstery course on Craftsy and she had a specific staple remover tool. I went into this project thinking that we had that tool on hand and I didn't, so we ordered it on Amazon and it didn't end up coming in the time that they said. So my dad ended up pulling so many staples on this with a flathead screwdriver and they were all breaking. It was awful, so shout out to Dad for this one. We're gonna reupholster over the old fabric here, but I wanted to lift the black lining fabric in some areas to avoid seeing the raw edge of the velvet. This won't really matter at all once the bed is made, you'll never see it, but because this is going in my sister's house and not my house, I wanna do everything that I can to make this look as professional as possible, so this is gonna help us get that professional upholstered look. Now, as I go throughout this project, I'm paying special attention to the way that the bed was already constructed. So if there are seams, I'm trying to put seams. If there are staples, I'm trying to put staples. No need to reinvent the wheel in the way this thing was done to start with. So if you're working on your own thrifted bed, it may not be the same as mine, but pay attention to the way that yours is constructed and see if you can replicate that. Okay, let's tackle these curvy wings. The headboard has Velcro on the back that allows us to open things up and access the bolts to remove the wing pieces. Again, I'm taking note of this as a guide so that we can reconstruct it the exact same way and keep it looking polished. With the wing removed, I can place it on top of some excess black fabric and trace around it with chalk to get that curved shape. Okay, so when I was calculating the fabric that I needed, I calculated for the narrow part of the wing at the top, but not for the wider part at the bottom, which is like significantly wider. So the strips that I cut for the wings are not wide enough to do both sides of the wing and that strip along the front. And I have no more fabric that is vertically long enough to keep the grain the same way. So we're gonna patch this together even more in the area where you can't see on the inside of the wing. So I'm gonna pull some excess from one of the other pieces, and hopefully we can patch this together well enough that we can have enough fabric. Now I'm adding a 1/2 inch seam allowance around the outside of that line and cutting this out to make our pattern. So I thought I had everything figured out for the cutting now, but then I realized the strips that I needed for the center of the wing were actually longer than I thought because they go up and over the curve on the top. Should have been paying more attention. So instead of piecing together the inside of the wings, I'm cutting both sides of the wing out of the fabric that I had allotted for this, and then cutting the center strips out of whatever fabric I had left over. The nap is going to be wrong on these pieces since I'm cutting the fabric widthwise, but at this point I'd done everything I could. I had to make this work. This was the last piece of fabric that I had. And honestly, you'll never be able to tell, but I just made sure the grain lines were symmetrical. Symmetry is key here. So with our wing pieces cut, I pinned the strip to the curve on one side and sew all the way along the edge, right sides together, making sure that my seam allowance was exactly at 1/2 inch so that the fit will be right. It was a bit tricky to sew around the curved area, but I went slowly and eased the fabric out so that I didn't have any folding along the curve. I did make some mistakes and have some areas where the fabric kind of pleated over, and so I had to rip that out and go and stitch it again. So this was not easy, but unlike with cutting, which is very permanent, sewing, you can always rip it out and do it again if you make a mistake. After sewing one side, I test the fit to make sure we're looking good, and then I sew the other side panel on and turn it right side out to check the fit once again. I'm pretty happy with this. Now we're going to top stitch these pieces as well, partly because I think it will hold down the seam allowance and make it clean, but also because that's how it looked on the original bed and I want to keep that professional look going. This was pretty tough around the curved edges, so I did pretty much all this off camera to spare my nerves, but you get the idea. Repeat this for the other side and our wings are done. The final bit of sewing is on the footboard where there's this little curved edge and a strip of velvet along the back. This detail might seem a little bit unnecessary, but I didn't want to risk any of the black fabric sewing once the piece was assembled. So again, we're going to follow the way this was done before. I have to assume they did this for a reason, so we're going to match it. I cut a strip of velvet and cut the black fabric down to the correct length. Then I sew those pieces right sides together and then stitch along the long seam again to create a nice clean L shape. And now we're ready to create the curved piece at the end. I traced the piece onto some paper like I did with the wing. That side I didn't draw at all. Then I can cut it out and add seam allowance to make the cut on my velvet. Now, this was the scary part because this piece has to fit perfectly lengthwise, so we very carefully measured the length and matched that on our piece from the center mark. I also marked the peak of the curve on the side rail piece and aligned that with the peak of the curve on my side piece, pinning right sides together all the way along the curve. And now we sew. And let's check the fit on one side to make sure the curve looks okay. Good so far. And the other side to test it again. And it fits! Yay! Now let's top stitch these seams to round out the sewing for this project. All right, upholstery time. For this project, we're using a pneumatic stapler with a compressor, but we've done many a project with an old school manual upholstery stapler, so there's a range of options for tools out there if you don't have the fancy stuff on hand. Okay, let's start on the headboard. First, we need to unscrew the hardware where the bed rails attach. Then we lay out the fabric and get the placement of our black seam right before putting a few staples on the bottom to hold that where we want it. Then we can stand this up and staple the velvet along the back top edge, smoothing out the fabric and trying to get even tension all along the top. Next, my mom is really good at folding the corners, so she makes a clean hospital corner of sorts, and my dad staples it to lock it in. I cut off the excess, and my mom cut out the holes for where the bolts will go to reattach the wings later. And now we repeat this process on the bottom side. slit in the fabric to reattach the bed rail hardware over the top of the fabric so that it looks clean and functions properly. We have a few more things to do on this piece, but let's set it aside for now. Now we can repeat these steps on the footboard and side rails, adjusting our order of steps and techniques to match the shape of each piece. When upholstering, it's always a good idea to place your key staples first in the center and the corners and throughout the piece, and then go back later to staple a bunch in between those. That way the tension can be distributed and any mistakes can be resolved before you put 500 staples in it. On all the pieces, after the velvet is attached, we reattach the black lining fabric over the raw edge of the velvet to keep this looking neat. Now, the wings were a little tougher since we needed tension from all directions, so we first got the top curve centered and tight to the curve of the wing and stapled that down on the back. Same on the bottom side. Now we wrap the sides of the fabric around to the back and staple one side over the other, making sure as we go that the seams run straight down the front corners. Then we create little wrapping paper folds along the bottom to lock those edges in, cutting away excess fabric to keep the hole where the leg attaches clear. Not too bad. Now we can cut out the holes where the bolts attach and see how this looks on the headboard. So good! As a final upholstery step on the headboard, we attach the black backing fabric and add the Velcro back along the sides. Remember that this allows us to access the wing attachment points if needed, but give a polished finish on the back. With the upholstery done, let's make some new legs for this piece. So many of my inspiration beds had really unique, high quality wood legs on them. And for this bed, I wanted something that was a little bit more classic and traditional to contrast a lot of the mid-century pieces that are going in this room. Now, I did find these unfinished legs on Amazon that I think would have worked pretty well, but were reissued, so we gotta make it complicated and fish in the trash a little bit. Also, I did want to squeeze this in under $200, so I found this damaged antique bed at the REISSUED for $10. Now, we're gonna chop off the legs here, and before you get sad, this thing has a terrible paint job. There's also some pulling apart of the wood up at the top of the headboard. We're gonna make good use of this, don't worry. For the front legs, my dad chops off 2 of the legs from the bed. I paint them with paint stripper, wrap them in plastic wrap, and leave them for a bit to bake. A couple hours later, I removed them and rinsed off the paint with the hose and washcloth. Round of applause for the amazing camera work here. We also sanded these a bunch off camera to even everything out. For the back legs, the original legs were in L shape to support both the back of the bed and the wing. So we need to do a larger leg here to provide support and also make everything look balanced. So we went to the shed and pulled out the final remaining piece of the bed that I pulled out of the trash at the REISSUED like a year and a half ago. Remember that we used this to make the chunky turn legs here in the studio. We also used another cut of this piece to make the legs on the little cabinet in my bathroom. So this was the last piece that we had here, and we're gonna chop off those pretty turn bits and make those into the back legs. So my dad cut these down to match the height at the front, minus 1 inch. We're gonna use part of that L-shaped piece, just 1 inch of that, in order to help us attach everything together. I'll show you that in a second. With all the pieces cut, I stained these in the shade Espresso. I wanted a dark wood look for contrast, but I also think it's a good idea to go dark when combining multiple wood types or different pieces to create one look. I also hit these with a coat of satin polyurethane to give them a more even finish. These would have done better with the second coat to even out the finish even more, but we kind of ran out of time here. Maybe I'll go back and do that later before we install this in the room. Before we attach the legs, my dad shows me a little hack to remove the bolts from the inside of the old legs. He puts 2 washers on the bolt and tightens them against each other with pliers. You're turning them in opposite directions?
Mm-hmm. Get them in tight. Okay.
And then you turn just the fat one at the bottom.
Just turn the fat one at the bottom.
Okay. Then he unscrews the bottom bolt so that the bolt unscrews from the leg. Magic! Now we can mark the placement of the front legs. Our hole will be off-center to make the placement of the leg look okay and not hang off the edge. My dad drills the hole and screws in the bolt, and I screw it into the footboard. The back legs are a little more complicated. We open up the back Velcro again and remove the wing to be able to access the headboard from the inside. Then we reattach the 1-inch strip of the original L-shaped leg with the original bolt. It's super long since it was intended for the original leg, but it just goes up inside the bed, so it's fine. Now we can add a little spacer piece, and then our leg, lining up the sides of the leg flush with the edges of the L-shaped piece. My dad drills and screws through the L-shaped piece into the bottom of the leg, and then up through the bottom of the bed to secure the leg. Now we can bolt the L-shaped piece into the wing with the original bolts and reattach the wing from the inside. Alright everybody, this project is more or less done. There's a couple things that we didn't fully address at this time. One is that the cross pieces that support the mattress, the original legs on those pieces are now not long enough to accommodate our longer outer legs, so we're gonna have to cut some new legs down to make sure the center of the bed is supported. Also, when I was planning this video, I had intended for my sister to take the bed back with her. She was up visiting last weekend, and so we were gonna finish everything up, and she was gonna take it back and shoot it in the room so we can get a sense of how that makeover is gonna look. However, this bed also does not fit in her car, so we're gonna take the bed down in a trailer at another time. But for now, I'm just gonna show you an after-ish setup in my parents' house. Keep an eye out for the mid-century wood nightstands. Those are the ones that I found at the REISSUED for $50 each that we're gonna mount on the wall next to this bed. So that kind of gives you an idea of the palette and the look that we're going for. I'm also gonna pop up this rendering again so that you can use your imagination. Shooting a king bed frame with no mattress or bed or anything just feels very weird. So it's not much of an after to look at, but hopefully you love how the bed turned out. I am super happy with how this turned out. I'm really proud of my sewing skills. Shout out to my parents for all their help on this one as well. They've been helping me so much lately. I have so many videos coming up back to back, so they're stepping in a lot to help me with various projects, so shout out to them. Anyway, if you like this video, hit the like button. If you love how the bed turned out, leave a comment down below. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you guys soon. Bye.